As we head toward NBA training camps, Phoenix Suns fans already moving on to the next star that they want to see traded to Phoenix. How realistic is that? And more importantly, what should the Suns do with their assets? Trade now, improve the roster, compete in 2023, or save and see what comes next in the never-ending parade of stars available in the NBA. We'll dive into it on today's episode of Locked On Suns.
You are Locked On Suns, your daily Phoenix Suns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
We are back. This is Locked On Phoenix Suns. We are part of the Locked On Podcast Network, and I'm your host, Brendon Kleen, a credentialed media member covering the Suns for the past 5 seasons and a writer at Suns.com and Dime Magazine. A big thanks for making Locked On Suns your first listen here on this Monday. We're recording Saturday. Hopefully we're not jumping the gun on anything. Appreciate all of you joining us. If it's your first time, if you're finding us on Spotify, Apple, every single podcast platform we are on, hit follow or subscribe. Make sure we're in your feed every single Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for the foreseeable future, hitting the ground running 5 days a week when training camp hits. So keep with us and on YouTube as well. We see you. Big shout out to all of you finding the show that way. That's honestly the best way to support the show. So if you're finding us there, if you've listened but you haven't subscribed on YouTube, hit subscribe, drop a comment below answering the question that we're starting today's show off with. Aaron Edwards is here to start the week. Aaron is being flexible, which I appreciate. We're mixing things up. We'll have Dan Bickley of Arizona Sports on Thursday's show. We'll have Dwayne Rankin of the Arizona Republic, I'm hoping, on Wednesday's show, but those two will definitely be rounding out the week for us. Let's get started, though, Aaron. As I kind of hinted at in that open, people are already on to the next thing. And we were joking right before we hit record that Shai Gilgeous-Alexander is already occupying a ton of attention in Suns fans' minds, despite no one ever saying he's actually available. I want to start there, though, because it is an interesting conversation, whether it's Shai Gilgeous-Alexander or any other number of people. I'll just present it to you as an opening question, and then I'll dive into some of the specific pathways they could go. But now that Kevin Durant's not an option for who knows how long, how aggressive would you be giving up major assets, not like Torrey Craig, but first-round picks, rotation players to go get something done right now versus keeping your powder dry, so to speak, and being ready for a Shai or whoever it might be who comes available?
I'm really just not in a rush to do any of that. I think what we're forgetting is we still have 3 really good players. This is a 4 to 3 to 2 seed. Like, I don't think we're going for the 1 seed this year. I think we're going to be content with the 3 through 6 at least. Like, I don't think it matters to them that much going forward. They did that part, so it doesn't really matter that much. So I think you can slow play.
And home court advantage didn't do them much good in round 2, did it? So what was the value, you know?
Yeah. So I could just see us slow playing this. There's no rush. The team's still good. It's going to be a middling playoff team, and I think you can still work with that and decide what you want to do later.
Yeah. I want to lay out kind of put names to some of this a little bit just to frame the conversation, but I'll just answer what you said by agreeing off the top that I'm like, the NBA is built around being ready to make trades like this, right? Whether we like it or not. What catapulted the Suns from like interesting bubble team, could they fight for the play-in in 2021 to the finals, mostly was Chris Paul getting here, right? They had the ability to make that trade. They got it done. It actually didn't even cost that much. It wasn't that hard to get that deal done. And then they were in place this year to go and get KD. And that's why for a lot of this summer, they were at the top of most sites' championship odds and then went down when they didn't get KD, right? So like, that's just the name of the game, whether you kind of like it or not. But I do think like balancing that is hard. So let's get into some of it a little bit more specifically. So like, we've talked about Jordan Clarkson a lot. I talked about Bojan Bogdanovic. I've seen him get mentioned here and there in different things around the Suns. Not a connection like a rumor, but just he makes sense here.
Yeah.
I think you could get those guys without a first-round pick, but you probably still have to send out some talent. Like, you're going to have to give up Jay Crowder, Landry Shamet. And, like, I know those guys aren't make-or-break players, but, like, that's still your rotation. So that matters. I think anyone like Harrison Barnes, who keeps getting mentioned, who I actually don't think is available. I don't know why we do that to ourselves every year. The Kings don't want to trade the guy, but I get why he's tantalizing. He's a great player. Julius Randle's been mentioned. I think those will cost a first-round pick plus a little bit of talent. Not a mega trade, but you're going to have to give up a pretty substantial amount to get them. All those things make you more likely to win in 2023. But then on the other side, you have, Kevin Durant, who might become available again. And then just to list off like other guys we know could be available upcoming, Pascal Siakam, Jaylen Brown, Damian Lillard, John Collins. I know those aren't all the same caliber of player, but like that's just off the top of my head, the guys we know might be moved. That's not even the guy we don't know who's going to be mad in 6 months, and then we'll all be, talking about that soon. So those aren't available now, but they might be the best play for your overall trajectory. So I think that's the balance that James Jones is striking. I've just heard a lot of people talking about how they just don't see it in terms of a move being made right now. What I hear is it's not worth it to cash in right now. We know the Suns have the pieces to make a trade if they really were aggressive about it before training camp. What I hear people saying is they just don't think that's worth it. It sounds like you and I are on the same page, but does that just sacrifice the ability to upgrade your title odds in 2023 in a year we know Chris Paul's also probably going to get worse again?
Yeah, I think there's no harm in slow playing it like it seems like James Jones is doing, because maybe Shamet decides to start shooting better and playing better, and it just makes it easier to get rid of. Maybe Crowder starts off high, and it makes it easier for him to get rid of. Like these people want to be gone anyway. Well, in Crowder's case, at least. So I think there's no real harm in like showing that these dudes can ball and seeing where they are like physically to probably up their trade value.
Yeah, it's interesting too when you mention it that way, because I do think we have a tendency to kind of group in all those guys as the same thing. And like Torrey Craig probably has no trade value at all. Like he did not play well. He wasn't even in the rotation. Jay Crowder, I think, would be really useful to teams who want to win right now. Like we just saw Royce O'Neal go for a first-round pick. He wasn't very good defensively in the playoffs. He's probably, in my opinion, a little bit of a lower IQ player than Crowder in terms of like, I don't feel like you can just plug and play O'Neal in any type of system. I think he fits really well with the Nets, but I think Crowder could fit really well anywhere because he's played in so many different types of systems. He's been a good ball mover, this and that. But then you have like Campaign, probably not super valuable. Landry Shamet, probably not super valuable. Dario Saric, I think, could be pretty good, but who's going to trade for him injured? So I think all of that it matters because it's not just like, they're not just salary pieces like we want them to be when we're doing trade machine stuff, right? Like it does matter who it is, especially if you're talking about some of these smaller trades where you're not getting rid of Mikal Bridges or Cam Johnson as the centerpiece of the value. Now you're talking about who actually wants the players we have, and that's a hard thing to find, right? So that's kind of one part of it that I think makes it harder than we're being realistic about. I think the other thing too, though, in terms of just the James Jones side of it is it's easy to say that like, and we'll talk about this more in the next segment because I want to get your thoughts on like the Suns being a destination and what Chris Paul and Kevin Durant wanting to be here means. But at the end of the day, those guys were good fits here. Like they played the same way as Booker plays. They were going to fit in what Monty wants to do. They had relationships with people in this organization. If you're talking about Pascal Siakam, for instance, who I just threw out there, like he's none of those things. I think he would fit here like stylistically, but like he doesn't have relationships. James Jones wants guys who fit and who are going to be good cultural fits and who make sense. He's not just going to do something if it makes the team theoretically 5% better.
Yeah, I think, well, it helps that he knows a lot of really good players personally. So I think he gets to make that decision that way because he knows a lot of people. But I think just having, and I'm like not really sure if it counts in Phoenix wise, but just having a black GM and a black coach is just going to be appealing to a lot of players. Like that's just how it works in the NBA. And when you're working with the higher ups and the business part of it, just the players probably feel more comfortable talking to James Jones about some of this stuff than a player usually would.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. I think back to Tyler Johnson, like his comfort level with James Jones was obvious, and I've mentioned it a lot of times that around the point in time when Tyler Johnson, which if you're a bandwagon person who hopped on with the finals, I'm sorry, I'm telling a story that predates when you were paying attention. I know that's
I was gonna say you're doing the Tyler Johnson bit right now.
That is a random name, but the point is valid because if you remember back to that point, Tyler Johnson was really good when he got traded here in 2018-19 at the very end of the year at the deadline. The next year he was bad, like just straight up bad. The Suns had to cut him. James Jones handled that about as deftly as I think you possibly could in terms of he had a relationship with Tyler because of their heat ties. They were both very open about that. He was very sensitive to the injury side of things. Like, I just think back to that a lot. It was also like the last season where we could actually be around anybody. So I'm sure that helps me in terms of being able to actually have seen it play out. But I think you're totally right that those connections, the comfort, the past, the former player factor, the race factor, all that stuff, it does make it easier for James Jones to do that. But I think that there's no denying that's how he operates. So that's just something to keep in mind. I think on that note, it leads perfectly to where I wanted to go. I did a segment on Friday's show, Aaron, where I was talking about, I think the Suns have proven with CP3 and KD both wanting to go there that they're kind of a destination city again. I don't think that angle of this is getting a lot of attention. So I want to get your thoughts on if you agree, to what extent you think that is going to make things different going forward. We'll do that in a second. First, today's show, guys, brought to you by Rocket Money. If you keep saying you need to make a budget but never do it, if somehow you keep missing credit card payments, I took out a credit card from a store on accident and I never paid that bill. If you're afraid to look at your bank statements, then it's time to take back control of your financial life. Meet Rocket Money, formerly Truebill, our favorite financial app here on the Locked On Podcast Network. So why did Truebill change its name to Rocket Money? We'll tell you what they heard. Truebill, now backed by Rocket Companies, has grown from a bill management app into a full-on personal finance empowerment tool that helps over 3.4 million people with budgeting, lowering bills, canceling subscriptions, and more, saving each of their members on average $700 per year. And with all that growth comes the next evolution in Truebill's story, a new name. Bottom line, Rocket Money is everything we've loved about Truebill, but with a fresh look and a fresh feel. Start canceling your unused subscriptions and save money at rocketmoney.com/lockedonnba. That's rocketmoney.com/lockedonnba, or download the app from the Apple App Store or Google Play Store and log on today. All right, so destination, I think that's kind of shorthand. It doesn't necessarily mean anything specific, but what I think of when I say that, Aaron, about the Suns is it's a place people want to go. It always had the factor of being nice weather in the winter when the NBA season's happening. It's close to LA. Scottsdale's a pretty nice place to spend your nights if you're 22 years old, 25 years old, 28 years old. But I think what we've seen is Book, Monty, and Jones, to me, are this trio that people want to be around. Like, I think we've almost overlooked that because they've been able to win so quickly, but that's kind of crazy. Like, it's not like it's Pat Riley in a meeting with LeBron James in 2010, right? Like, it's pretty crazy how quickly that's changed, but I do think it has. Do you feel the same way? Do you think the Suns are a destination organization now?
Yeah, I think just Book is just likable around the league. I think they could just tell like that he likes basketball and he grinded it out. And like, I'm sure like just in the player empowerment era, like it's not something that the players pay attention to that much. They don't really care if you stick to a place and you're losing there. Like, it's not really a big deal either way to them. But I think that like how Book did it with no complaints and just going out and getting buckets with dudes you probably can't remember right now. Like, I think that kind of holds sway that he stuck it through and was part of a real turnaround. I'm not sure if the Chris Paul thing is going to hold much sway that much longer. Like, he's going to be old and the fall off is going to come. It's just the way.
I also don't think he's necessarily a guy that people are like always jazzed to play with. Like, yeah. I do think there's some hesitancy on that part of it, but I think you're right. Yeah.
And he understands that he rubs people the wrong way. That's why he said when he got here, he knew like they had that first practice that him and Book went at it, or it was a pickup game. And he was like, this dude gets it. Like, we're the same. And I think that people who do want to come here to this destination, knowing that Chris Paul is there, they have to know what they're getting themselves into because the stories are out there. Like, we know what type of dude he is. So I think anybody that wants to be a part of it knows what they're trying to be a part of.
Yeah, I think with Book, it's like, I think your point about it not always being like as big of a deal as maybe like Phoenix fans think it is in terms of like the commitment and all that good stuff. But I do think the way that he held himself during all of it, that did, that was noticed. Like Chris Paul has talked about that. Even Monty talked about that when he got hired. Like, I think we forget about, if you're talking about the Suns as a destination, like even Monty choosing to come here, I think fits into that a little bit, because he could have gone and coached LeBron James in LA. He chose not to do that. He came here instead. He mentioned the way that Book held himself and handled his business during all of that mattered. Speaking of the Lakers, let me put it to you this way. So if, like, Lakers fans right now, if to pick another player off the list that I listed off a minute ago, if Damian Lillard, if a Woj tweet comes down, Damian Lillard has met with, I don't even know who's running the Blazers anymore because everything's changed.
Jody Allen.
Yeah, the owner, Jody Allen, yes. And said, I'm out. Like, I know I just signed that extension. I know I've been here. I wanted to make it work, but whatever happened, I'm done. Lakers fans expect a subsequent tweet right after that says one of Lillard's chosen preferred destinations is Los Angeles to play with LeBron James and Anthony Davis. Are the Suns headed toward a place where Suns fans are just going to assume that tweet's coming about Phoenix every single time? Like, are we talking about that level for the Suns, or what has to happen to keep building on that?
I think in an instance with Dame, like, I would have a hard time not assuming, honestly. Like, it's very clear the love that Dame and Book have for each other. They've been very open about it. Dame, especially when he got injured for the All-Star game, he requested that Book replace him. Like, so I think when it comes to certain players, I think it would be hard for Suns fans not to. But there are, like, other ones where it just doesn't seem possible at all. And, like, I just wouldn't assume that a certain star would come here at that point.
How much do you think, because I think this is an interesting way to look at it. You mentioned what matters to players when it comes to that commitment factor and what doesn't matter, or what gets noticed, I think is probably a better way to put it. Like, we sometimes feel, I think sometimes this stuff gets talked about as if like all these guys are on Twitter as much as we all are or whatever, you know what I mean? Or like watching Sports Center as much as we are watching First Take, watching whatever. They're not. I mean, I think they do it more than they say, but I don't think they do it as much as fans do. How much do you think the Robert Sarver thing matters? Because that kind of surprised me with both Chris, especially Chris, I would say, although we know the craziest allegations hadn't necessarily been super public at the time that Chris wanted to come here. But and then with KD, it was. I think that, I don't think he's as public facing about caring about a lot of that stuff, and like it would affect him one way or the other, like we would assume with Chris, who is in social justice activism stuff and has made his feelings known. But how much do you think, even setting aside like the racism or whatever as much as we can, like he's also just like not a very good owner. He doesn't have a good track record of creating winning teams. How much do you think that matters to people? Because I never really know. There's no way to know, but what do you think?
I think it's less the bad owner part, and I think it's he was disrespectful to players that people loved. Like, I think that's the part that would be harder for stars to get over. Like, the way that he talks to players is probably the stories that people would have like probably rubbed them the wrong way. The way he treated Amari, like, it's beloved players that Hoopers love, like not just like the fans, like the AAU dudes that grew up watching him and just hearing probably from his mouth, like him going out and telling people how Sarver talked to him and stuff like that. I think that would rub players the wrong way and make them kind of second guess coming here, just hearing stories about how a star player was talked to by an owner.
Yeah, Eric Bledsoe, Goran Dragic, Raja Bell has told stories on his podcast about being told to his face that he could get an extension, but Sarver was just not going to do it to prove some kind of petty point. Like, if we know all those stories, imagine how many there are like that we don't know, right? So, yeah, I tend to lean the same way as you, but that just makes it even more surprising that some of these guys have wanted to come here. I think that maybe the thing is, rather than like Amari is a little bit of an outlier because he was a star player, but I think the difference is a Chris Paul or a Kevin Durant can come here and they can probably feel pretty comfortable that they're not going to have more power than the owner because nobody does, but they're not going to be as affected by an obnoxious owner as somebody else might be, right? Like Chris Paul survived not only Sterling for however long that lasted. Yeah, exactly. And then also Steve Ballmer, who's kind of a weird dude. Like he spends, but I can't imagine it's like a blast to hang out with Steve Ballmer. He seems like kind of a weirdo, right? So like, I think those guys can kind of drift above all that a little bit.
Yeah, I was going to say stars and a good coach and a GM. Technically, Doc was both around that time, but I think that can kind of just cover for a really bad owner that people don't like for the most part. Like, I think that if you have a cool coach, GM, and cool players on a team, they put a really good Clippers team together with Donald Sterling as the owner. And it was known in the 80s how awful Donald Sterling was. So I think if you can put just the below foundation together, I think players will still want to come to that.
Yeah, Donald Sterling, who in the 80s was convicted of racial redlining as a real estate owner. Like insane the stuff that there was going on. Separate point, we don't do a Clippers podcast, but I'm going to be excited about the FX show or whatever it is and how much they just rip him to shreds. They cast somebody as Chris Paul. Did you see that? It does not look like Chris Paul.
I feel like it's hard to cast play. Like this happened in our lifetime. So I think it's just weird in our brains. Like usually it has to be really far away for us to be like, yeah, that kind of looks like Chris Paul.
They got screwed over, I think, because of how much Adam McKay nailed the Kareem and Magic castings. Like in winning time, those guys looked exactly like Kareem and Magic. Like even it wasn't just like for a TV show. It was like if I saw Quincy Isaiah out in public, I would wonder how much if he was related to Magic Johnson or something. But let's close things out with a little bit of a different way of talking about this question yet again. I put a tweet out because I was kind of curious, like, what should we be talking about in the lead up to camp? What's on people's minds? Obviously, there's trade stuff if and when that happens, but like, just what's the tempo? What's the pulse of the fan base? And I put out a tweet, and a lot of people were talking about the title window right now. So I want to do a little bit of conversation there. We'll probably continue that throughout the week, but first one quick break. All right, we're back here talking about the Suns title window. I think it's an interesting conversation because people seem to convince themselves, I think during the course of this Kevin Durant thing, that this was going to kind of save the Suns' future a little bit. That's confusing to me because he's 34. It's not like he's like 10 years younger than Chris Paul. So that's kind of funny to me. But also, I'm not necessarily of the belief that they need to worry about the title window collapsing. I think what they've been able to do, Aaron, like, do I think once Chris Paul ages out or retires or goes to the Lakers for one last year, whatever it ends up being, do I think that they'll be as great as maybe we thought they were heading into like this year's playoffs? No, but you see with these great teams that they can have different chapters, right? Like the Celtics, I think, are a good example of that. They finally made the finals after they lost all the veteran stars that were supposed to take them there, right? Like then they got in because Tatum and Brown took them there. So I was a little bit surprised to see people. I know it's right in the aftermath of KD not coming, but that surprised me that so many people were just saying it was closed. Were asking me if I thought it was closed. I just don't see it that way.
No, I think Book's not in his prime yet. Like we still have to get to that. Ayton's 22 years old. Like I think having a foundation of players, Mikal Bridges is coming off of runner-up to Defensive Player of the Year. I think that a title window for a team with that many accomplished people. Cam Johnson was shooting the leather off the ball before he got injured. Like I think that this team still has a pretty good like foundation to keep a title window open. Like it needs like one or two other pieces, but I'm not really worried about that because Book is still 2 years away from his prime. So I think that everything will still like come together pretty easily for like title wise.
Yeah, like look, people make the comparisons to the Warriors because of how the Suns have built the team. They had one first overall pick, but he hasn't even panned out to the best way he could have. But Booker outside the top 10, Mikhail at 10, Cam Johnson outside the top 10. I'm not saying any of those guys are Steph Curry. I'm not even saying any of them are Klay Thompson. I know it's not a one-to-one comparison, but just in terms of that timeline, as another example, like you had the Warriors make the second round in 2013. They didn't get KD until 3 years later. They lost KD 3 years after that. Then they made the finals again this year, right? Like, because they had that core, do the Suns make 5 finals or 6 finals? I'm not saying that. But I do think if you have that young core and you're committed to paying them, which the Suns now have paid all 3 of their main core players, and Cam's going to be not that long after, you buy yourself that time to keep being a different version of yourself. And they have the flexibility. James Jones has done an amazing job, like we were just talking about in the first segment. They're ready to make other trades so they can keep adding, but they'll always have Booker, Bridges, and Ayton. Maybe those guys also get traded down the line, but they have that as a starting point. And like you said, none of them are even in their prime yet. So I get it's bleak right now. The Game 7 sucked. Losing out on KD sucked. But like, I'm sure there's at least like 15, 20 NBA fan bases that would trade everything they have for what the Suns have right now. Like, we need to keep that in mind.
Yeah, I think especially coming from where we came from, I think a good point comes from just you talk about how the Warriors had to jump when they had to get the first pick in the draft, and then they have to kind of just plug in the spots that were missing, and so does Bonnie. Like, I think coming from the tree of Pop, who did it for years, like that's like the thing he was known for. Greg Popovich, like he always plugged in. He just had to have this base, and he changed the way his teams played based off of the roster that he put out there. And I think Steve Kerr did the same, and I think that Monty learned under the same dudes, and I think he could do the same too.
Yeah, I think that's actually, to keep on that, in the 2019 playoffs, like I think this has gotten lost over time. Even with KD and Klay healthy, if they had been by the end of the finals, I think they beat Toronto, but that's beside the point here. They're 7 through 10 in that rotation. So they had Iguodala, Durant, the death lineup, and then Kevon Looney, right? Those guys are great. But below that was Sean Livingston in his last season scoring 4 points a game in the playoffs, DeMarcus Cousins on a prove-it deal, Quinn Cook, who was never really an NBA player. Amazing dude. I've interviewed him, but not an NBA player. And then Alfonso McKinney, also not an NBA player. They kind of needed that reset. And so obviously it got really bad because Steph got hurt and Draymond was out of shape and Klay was recovering. I don't think you project that you have to be like a lottery team for 3 straight years, but I do think like that kind of shows that they can see out the Chris Paul thing. Would it be amazing if they got Shea or Dame and never missed a beat? Yeah, but I also think you could imagine a couple of seasons where maybe the Suns are like the 6 seed, the 5 seed, and then they come out of that with a little more flexibility. They move around the roster a little bit, and then when Book's 30, maybe they're back to being a finals team after a few seasons that we're in the middle of right now where they've been a finals team. And I don't know, maybe that's not awesome to hear, but like the reality is teams don't just stay in finals contention for a decade. Like that's unrealistic. So they're on a good path, all things considered, I think. And they have all their picks.
Yeah, having all your picks and your young star like coming into it, he's got a taste of the finals now, and your vet still being one of like the top players on the team. Like maybe it's going to end soon, but having a dude like that with 2 young stars that aren't even close to their prime yet, or one is close, like I think that you can build off of that even after Chris Paul leaves, and you get the flexibility of that roster spot, and maybe people wanting to play with Devin Booker and Ayton after seeing that they kind of figured it out.
Yeah, to round all this out, a question that's coming to mind for me that I wonder how you feel about is, if you're James Jones and you are thinking, how do I stay flexible? Who might be available? What relationships can I tap into? All that stuff that is how he operates. How much do you care about it being a point guard? Because I think that is part of why Suns fans are jumping right to Shea. Is I think there's a little bit of anxiety, understandably. I mean, it's a big question facing the team is like, what happens after Chris Paul? Because right now, if you just told me campaign or whoever they can get on like a mid-level exception is going to be the starting point guard, I would be pretty worried. I don't think it's always that simple. There's a million different iterations of what that could be. But are you somebody who thinks like point guard should be the focus, or you just literally just kind of wait and see what happens and morph your team accordingly? Because I think both have. I could see either way. I don't know what the right answer is because there's so many point guards, but you also don't want to be left with nothing when Chris leaves.
Yeah, I'd rather just not be left with nothing when Chris leaves. And I know Book would rather that too. Like, I know he got his stats and he got like most of his accolades when it was point book season, and he had the ball in his hand a majority of the time. But I think after getting such easy buckets with Chris and not having to do all the work and just the spacing that he had, I think he would much rather just having a good point guard again for the rest of his career. I think he did that phase of his career, and I don't think he wants to do it again.
Even with Rubio, right? Like,
yeah,
it doesn't always have to be. I mean, you probably want somebody a little bit more playoff ready than Rubio, but I think even that was probably, I don't know. I still feel like the highs of that season statistically were some of the best moments of Book's entire career when you look at what he was doing with assists and scoring, and it was efficient and everything else. So I don't think you have to get a Hall of Famer at point guard when he leaves, but I think there's a tendency with Monty's system and the way, who's available, who's been available at different times to say, like, I mean, even with KD, it would have been a question, right? You're probably not getting an all-star level point guard after Chris Paul retires, but while KD would have still been on his contract. I think there's a tendency for fans to kind of feel like we'll just figure it out, whether it's like you said, it's just Book who could be the more of the ball handler, or it's some other version. But I do think it should be a little bit of a priority. I don't think, for instance, like let's say it's Siakam. I don't even think the Suns have ever talked to anybody, but like just because he's like this ball handling, playmaking forward. I think that if you got him or a player like him and then a Ricky Rubio level point guard, I think that version of the team is worse than just getting another point guard that's like Paul, right? So I do kind of think, I don't know, that's not what I was expecting to say. I thought I would have the other perspective on it, but now talking to you, I'm kind of like, I think with how Monty wants to run things and the way that Book has gotten so much better playing off of a point guard like that, I do think you want to keep the structure of that in place. That just, it's a harder thing to do because there's not a ton of players who can do that.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, we can say this part too. Chris Paul doesn't exactly run Monty's system. He runs Chris Paul's system. So I think just having a point guard, even after Chris Paul, we get to see what this offense looks like again. Like, it hasn't been Monty's system for a really long time. And that was kind of the issue in the playoffs was once Chris Paul stopped being Chris Paul, like, they automatically had to run to Monty's system again, and Chris Paul couldn't do it. So I think once we're able to actually run Monty's system again and see what the point guard can do in it and the spacing and how open people are getting, like, I think we'll have a clearer view on what this team actually like could be. And
there's honestly, like, especially at this point in time in the NBA, there's really not even any point guards like Chris Paul. So it's going to be different.
Yeah.
It's like, I mean, Darius Garland, like, it's few and far between. And I'm not saying he's available. I want to see him be in Cleveland. It's cool. But you know what I mean? Like, even if it's Shea doesn't play like Chris Paul. Like, Shea scores and then he'll get you like 6 assists a game. Like, it's going to look different. I'm kind of excited this season, I guess, as a way to wrap up. Like, I do think we'll see some more of that. I think that one of the things about this year to be excited about, even if they run it back roster-wise, is I do think, like, there's no way Chris plays 33 minutes a game again. There's no way that he dominates the ball the way that he has. So I think we'll get – and I think Dario coming back could really be big for some of this stuff. We'll see more of that again, I think, I hope. I could see Chris Paul playing more of that late career, like Jason Kidd type of role that we've seen a lot of these guys transition to, where it's like, I'm going to initiate stuff. I can score still, but like mostly I'm going to initiate. I'm going to rotate, be smart on defense, and I'm going to take and make threes. Like, that could be what we kind of see from Chris Paul this year a little bit more, and maybe some other stuff gets to flash as a result of that. But we'll have to continue to see. I don't know. I don't know if maybe the roster will look different by camp, but as of now, I guess the main point coming from both of us, 4 fans who are worried, is like, it's still pretty good. Is it the best it could have been? Maybe not. But it's still pretty good. There's a lot to be optimistic about. So as we start our September and camp is coming closer, hopefully that gives people a little bit of peace of mind. That will wrap us up for Monday. I expect Wednesday will be the next time that we have a show, and then we'll have another one Thursday, and then I will be out, but I'm going to pack in this week for you guys to get plenty leading into training camp month. So a big thanks for listening, making Locked On Suns your first listen. Follow, subscribe, hit subscribe on YouTube, all of it. And in the meantime, guys, make Locked On NBA your second listen to catch up on everything else going on around the league this Monday.